Welcome everyone to the fourth and last day of this festival. It's the What Now Festival 2014. I'm just going to say a couple of sentences for the people who haven't been with us the previous days. So this is the sixth in a series of What festivals organized by Independent Dance, supported by the Siobhan Davis Studios. This year the festival is slightly different. It took the form of a public residency. So 24 artists have been sleeping and living and working and eating in this building since Thursday morning. So it's our fourth day. The public have been invited to come in since Friday, so it's the public's third day. We've been engaged in a number of activities. Some of them have come up like pop-up activities, others have been more organized and declared. And part of that negotiation has been, I guess, what we have been dealing with and playing with and questioning. We have invited four speakers to come and give talks during these 4 days as a way to have input from the outside feed into our work. Today we've got Laura Cull Maoilearca, did I pronounce that well? Great. Who is our final speaker for today. I guess we're excited because Laura has, first she has worked with artists as a theorist, as a thinker, but also she's kind of one of the key figures who manages to bridge philosophy and performance and work in, let's say, a new field, perhaps that is performance philosophy. So Laura is a senior lecturer in theatre studies at the University of Surrey. She has written a book called Theatres of Immanence, Deleuze and the Ethics of Performance, as well as edited other collections. And she's one of the key core founders of the Performance Philosophy Professional Association. So we're very excited that you're here. We'll have a talk up here, and then we'll move on to the level below in the studio, the research studio downstairs, for a discussion. So we'll have a short break in between and reconvene after the talk for discussion. Thank you.
So hello, everybody. You'll have noticed a slight change in the title of the presentation. I'm afraid Moina Matha's, Henri Bergson's sister, has also disappeared from the presentation as well, but otherwise hopefully it's broadly as advertised. I've brought along my very own attention-grabbing device, who's sitting in the side of the auditorium there, and as Karen Christopher appropriately mentioned, the topic of attention seems an apt one for a new parent. So you'll forgive me if there are any parts of the presentation that seem somewhat rambling or distracted. They may well just be kind of reflecting their conditions of production in some way. So many thanks to Efrosini, to Independent Dance, and to the Siobhan Davis Studios for having me, inviting me to talk today. I've decided to use this time to talk about the notion of attention. I hope because I've correctly identified that as an... There he goes. It's the sound of Mummy's voice. As an area of shared interest, I hope, between myself and the festival, given that I noticed that Independent Dance chose to put this quote from Franco Bifo Berardi on the festival website. He says, "We can reach every point in the world, but more importantly, we can be reached from any point in the world. Privacy and its possibilities are abolished. Attention is under siege everywhere. Not silence, but uninterrupted noise. Not the red desert, but a cognitive space overcharged with nervous incentives to act. This is the alienation of our times. Workers commonly and voluntarily work overtime. The population is tethered to cell phones and Blackberries. Debt has become a postmodern form of slavery, and antidepressants are commonly used to meet the unending pressure of production. As a result, the conditions for community have run aground, and new philosophical categories are needed." Elsewhere, Biffo's also made statements like the following: virtual workers have less and less time for attention. They're involved in a growing number of intellectual tasks, and they have no more time to devote to their own life, to love, tenderness, and affection. So here then, he's suggesting at least 4 different causes for and characteristics of the besiegement of attention. First, an inability or refusal to detach ourselves from communications technologies. Secondly, a continuous bombardment with stimulus and interruptions. Third, a state of being compelled into action without sufficient time for forethought. And finally, an expansion of the sphere of work at the expense of all other forms of activity. And as we'll see today, he's by no means alone in identifying what we might call a contemporary crisis of attention, nor in pointing to the roles of technology and capitalism in relation to its production. But what's the nature of this attention that we're being called upon to defend? What are the stakes of this so-called crisis or siege? What follows is an indirect and still very much in progress reflection on these kinds of questions, motivated by the hunch that performance and philosophy, or what we've been calling performance philosophy, can make important contributions both to the contemporary discourse on attention, but also to our experience of attention. In particular, I'm interested in attention as a way to conceive and perform a closer and more open relationship to what we might variously describe as the fundamental movement, change, creativity, or novelty that characterizes the real. Attention, then, less as a matter of a conscious subject thinking about something, some object, deeply or otherwise, or looking at something intensely or otherwise, or as always on the lookout and willing to be distracted by the next apparently new thing, and more as an instance of reciprocal contact between thinking processes, to move with movement rather than capture and freeze it, to open ourselves up to the unpredictability and interconnectivity of living processes rather than cut out what we can immediately use from experience and ignore the rest. As media theorist Tiziana Terranova suggests, what we need is a further exploration of some other ways in which paying attention can become a practice that will be able to produce different forms of subjectivity and different models of what an economy of social cooperation could be like. I'll not be able to kind of provide these in full here, but at least maybe we can have these kind of stakes in the back of our mind as we go along. So over the last 20 years or so, the concept of attention has been much discussed across a range of disciplines, including dance and performance studies. There have been journal issues dedicated to the topic. You may have seen that there's a seminar series running at King's College at the moment called For the Attention Of, that's on the topic of attention. And there's been a flurry of publishing, particularly around the notion of the attention economy. This idea has been developed in the 1990s by scholars such as Jonathan Beller, Michael Goldhaber, and Georg Frank. The idea being that our economy, quote, is a system that revolves primarily around paying, receiving, and seeking what is most intrinsically limited and not replaceable by anything else, namely the attention of other human beings. Building on existing work done by figures like Herbert Simon in the 1970s, the notion of attention economics conceives attention as a scarce resource in contrast to a proliferation and excess of information or data. For Simon, information is that which consumes the attention of its recipients, and therefore attention is that which limits our power to consume data. He says, quote, "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention, and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it. Attention-seeking entities, content producers, must compete for the attention of consumers, which is often deemed measurable today in clicks, downloads, likes, followers, and so forth. In 1999, as Terra Nova notes, Georg Frank attempted to describe attention as, the new currency of business, proposing that attention constitutes a new kind of capital, and even a kind of wage or income, such as that generated by fame and celebrity. So as Terra Nova has summarized, attention is scarce and must be competed for because it is constrained on two accounts. First, by the limits inherent to the neurophysiology of perception on the one hand, and secondly, by the social limitations to time available for consumption on the other. This is not a nature-culture duality, though, given the plasticity assigned to the brain or the mutability of attention by the cultural practices we engage with, whether for good or ill. And indeed, Terra Nova notes that the discussions of the attention economy are often accompanied by the notion of the degradation of attention, provoked by digital technologies and its economic effects. In particular, she suggests the contemporary crisis of attentiveness has been partly, quote, elaborated in terms of the impact of internet usage on the cognitive architecture of a neuroplastic and mimetic social brain, exploring the ways in which our engagements with new media might produce a rewiring of attention, as she puts it, via activities such as multitasking and reading hyperlinked texts. One example of this kind of thinking about the mutability of the brain through our cultural activities, is the work of Nicholas Carr, most famously in his 2010 book, The Shallows, How the Internet is Changing the Way We Read, Think, and Remember, in which he argues that our use of the internet involves using our brains in ways that exercise the neural circuits devoted to skimming and multitasking while ignoring those used for reading and thinking deeply. Although, of course, I read his text on the internet, so I may well be misrepresenting his argument. He says, the internet is an interruption system. It seizes our attention only to scramble it. The penalty is amplified by what brain scientists call switching costs. Every time we shift our attention, the brain has to reorient itself, further taxing our mental resources. As a culture, he argues, we are remaking the neurology of our attention in a manner that will ultimately normalize a superficial, distracted engagement with the world rather than a deep, profound one. While Carr does acknowledge that, quote, the ability to scan and browse is as important as the ability to read deeply and think attentively, and hence that the internet has not had a purely negative impact on the nature of our thinking, he does argue that, quote, skimming is becoming our dominant mode of thought. Once a means to an end, a way to identify information for further study, it's becoming an end in itself, our preferred method of both learning and analysis. As Terra Nova notes, though, it's not that this concern with attention, the degradation of attention and so forth, is unique to our times. This is not a new concern. Rather, she suggests that these new theories of the attention economy might be profitably considered as a continuation, quote, of the modern theme of the crisis of attentiveness, so effectively articulated by cultural historian Jonathan Crary. So in his important book, Suspensions of Perception, Attention, Spectacle, and Modern Culture from 2001, Crary argues that attentiveness became not only an object of scientific concern, but also a focal social problem in the late 19th century, so in much the same way as it's become a problem and a question for science now. As Crary acknowledges, modernity has long been characterized in terms of experiences of inattention or distraction. Whether we think of the work of Siegfried Kracauer, Walter Benjamin, or Theodor Adorno, writing about distraction as a regression of perception to an infantile state. But where Crary wants to differentiate his own work from this tradition concerns his insistence that we think attention and distraction together, as belonging to a continuum of behavior rather than as a fundamental binary or duality. This is particularly in contrast to Walter Benjamin, for instance, who said that distraction and concentration form polar opposites. In contrast, Crary argues, and this is the top quote here, modern distraction was not a disruption of stable or natural kinds of sustained value-laden perception that had existed for centuries, but was an effect, and in many cases a constituent element of the many attempts to produce attentiveness in human subjects. If distraction emerges as a problem in the late 19th century, it's inseparable from the parallel construction of an attentive observer in various domains. So in particular, Crary suggests that modern industrial capitalism is in a kind of double bind, insofar as it both produces, but must also find ways to manage and discipline distraction or inattention. Or again, it's because Crary conceives attention and distraction as continuous that he maintains that the production of attention is always at risk of producing behavior that tips over into its so-called opposite, inattention, where concentration, for instance, becomes trance, the power to multitask falls into experiences of dissociation. For Crary, modern culture produces an ongoing crisis of attentiveness in which, quote, the changing configurations of capitalism continually push attention and distraction to new limits and thresholds, with an endless sequence of new products, sources of information, sources of stimulation and streams of information, and then responds with new methods for managing and regulating perception. Now, likewise, it requires its workers to be perpetually connected to mobile communications devices, as Bifo discusses, at the same time as it concerns itself with how to treat problems of inattention, particularly in children, for instance, through the diagnostic category of attention deficit disorder. And rather controversially, Jonathan Crary kind of claims that this is a pure, function of institutional power, that there is no experimental or empirical basis for the notion of attention deficit disorder. So we're not short of concepts of attention then. We have this informational paradigm on the one hand and the culturalist paradigm with Crary. But I'd suggest that there are problems and limitations with many of these discourses such that new concepts of attention are still required, particularly in order to consider the relationship between attention and movement, or change, creativity, and the new. So when I say movement, I'm not thinking in terms of movement from A to B in space. I'm talking about movement, as we'll see in terms of the philosopher Henri Bergson, as a production of the new, a process producing the new. The discourse on attention economy, for instance, has a tendency to reduce attention to the consumption of information by an apparently disembodied mind, or at least a brain seemingly cut off from the rest of the body. For Davenport and Beck, for instance, quote, attention is focused mental engagement on a particular item of information. Items come into our awareness, we attend to a particular item, and then we decide whether to act. So attention isn't seen as an act in itself, it's separated from it. In Nicholas Carr's work, in terms of the guy on the internet as an interruption system, the emphasis on the impact of the internet arguably has the effect of equating attention with vision at the expense of all the other senses. Crary's work is almost at the opposite pole of this spectrum, insofar as he insists that, and this is the bottom quote, he's not concerned with whether or not there is some empirically identifiable mental or neurological capacity for attention, so none of this rewiring the brain business. It is an object for me only in terms of this massive accumulation of statements and concrete social practices during a specific historical period that presumed the existence and importance of such a capacity. I use the term attention, he says, not to hypostatize it as a substantive object, but to refer to the field of those statements and practices and to a network of effects which they produce. As such, it seems that there's no room in Crary's argument for human discourses and practices to be reciprocally construed as effects of empirical or biological forces. Attention becomes a merely human invention, denaturalizing the force of invention itself. This is not about saying, or my position is not about saying that attention is simply out there to be discovered and measured as material fact, but about acknowledging the processual, material dimension of acts of conceptualizing. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to look at the work of the philosopher Henri Bergson, alongside that of the American artist Alan Capro, to try and provide a kind of counter view on attention in relation to these other paradigms that I've introduced. In particular, a kind of counter to the tendency to associate attention with a narrowing of perception and with an immobilizing gaze, to associate attention with a fixing or a form of stasis rather than with movement. So that is despite the fact that the etymology of the verb to attend implies a notion of movement, so literally to stretch toward, from ad to tendere, stretch, the notion of stretching one's mind towards something. Crary notes that it's still often understood to imply the possibility of a fixation, of holding something in wonder or contemplation, in which the attentive subject is both immobile and ungrounded. So a sort of an attentive dancer would be a contradiction in terms, according to that kind of model. Most commonly, perhaps, attention is understood to operate as a kind of spotlight. The pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, for instance, conceives it as a directed beam of mental focus that shines a light on a particular object, instead of diffusing consciousness over all the elements presented to it. Correlatively, Crary notes how the vast majority of late 19th century accounts of paying attention specifically involve what he describes as, quote, a disengagement from a broader field of attraction, so a cutting of yourself out of the world, whether visual or auditory, for the sake of isolating or focusing on a reduced number of stimuli. Attention in this conventional account is understood as a process of selection and exclusion then, feeding into discursive constructions of normative and pathological subjects as that which secures the coherence of consciousness. So attention is a kind of defense against aimless thought, sensory bombardment, and perpetual distraction. That way madness lies, those discourse suggests. In contrast, Henri Bergson is interested in a notion of attention as that which precisely broadens or extends our field of perception, working towards a greater inclusion rather than exclusion of worldly sensations, and in particular, attention as that which opens us up to the perception of change and movement. What in other discourses might be construed as pathological attentiveness to an excess of sensations, that is, as a failure of attention associated with schizophrenia, for instance, becomes in Bergson a desirable expansion of attention that produces a mode of life immanent to the movement of the world. Indeed, Bergson almost goes to the point of pathologizing our ordinary perception. So it's what we ordinarily do that becomes the strange, weird, kind of unhealthy practice, arguing, quote, that knowledge is the effect of a sudden dissociation, in which we only select that which concerns our action upon things and neglect the rest. However, Bergson also suggests that this extended field of perception is already there, as it were, that there is much that we perceive without seeing, or as Howard Kagel has put it, we see much more than consciousness allows us to see. We attend to more than we know. In the collection of texts that make up his last published work, The Creative Mind from 1934, Bergson characterizes ordinary perception as both utilitarian and relative. Our faculties of perception and action are attached to one another, he argues, the result of which is that perception, quote, tends to turn away from what it has a material interest in not seeing. Already in Matter and Memory from 1896, Bergson had argued that perceptual action tends to be reductive and immobilizing, insofar as it is determined by interest. We insist on a clear-cut distinction between things and their environment, the division of matter into objects, in order to be able to act upon it. Life demands that we put on blinders, Bergson contends, and yet philosophy can lead us to a completer perception of reality by means of a certain displacement of our attention away from the merely useful. So he's giving a clear role to a practice of philosophy here. Philosophy, he says, needs to provide an education of the attention that removes these perceptual blinders and frees perception from the contraction that it is accustomed to by the demands of life. We are obliged to narrow and drain our vision on account of our attachment to reality, our need for living and acting. We see things not in their own right, he suggests, but according to their use for us, in ways that demand rendering immobile and quantifiable the uninterrupted change and indivisible movement of life. Bergson says, immobility being the prerequisite for our action, we set it up as a reality. We make of it an absolute, and we see in movement something which is superimposed. Nothing is more legitimate in practice. So it's, he's not sort of condemning it outright. This is a necessary part of getting on with the everyday. But when we transport this habit of mind into the domain of speculation, we fail to recognize the true reality. We deliberately create insoluble problems. We close our eyes to what is most living in the real, namely for him, change. As Crary notes, much modern philosophy from Kant to Lacan and Derrida has insisted on a fundamental, quote, absence at the heart of seeing, on the impossibility of the perception of presence, of an unmediated visual access to a plenitude of being. But we won't find this kind of attitude in Bergson, that there's some kind of impossibility of accessing the real. However, when Bergson speaks of completeness here, this completer perception of reality, it's not so much that an education of attention will allow us to perceive the truth of some self-identical world, but it's about attending to change and movement and to the open whole as something unpredictable and processual rather than given. Now, such a perspective might seem to be kind of pro-theory and anti-practice, a call to delay action with contemplation, to protect philosophy from the need to act in ways that might seem to suggest a degree of passivity or political disengagement. But I don't think that this is what Bergson is saying. His concern is arguably more with the predominance of goal-oriented action rather than action per se. And if his concept of attention does suggest a kind of passivity, it is still one that demands a certain effort or commitment or gesture. So it's a kind of rethinking of what we're volunteering for, or how we volunteer. In Matter and Memory, Bergson argues that attention implies a turning back of the mind, which gives up pursuing any useful end of the present perception. In this way, what seems to single out Bergson's account of attention is his sense of its potential to allow us to encounter difference or the genuinely new as distinct from the endless, apparently new objects of capitalism that are supposed to attract our attention and at the same time ensure our distraction, but which are largely less new and more recognizable than they claim to be. As Crary recounts, the emerging cultural logic of capitalism starting in the late 19th century and extending to the present has seen a naturalization of distraction, of attention as that which can and should rapidly switch from one thing to another. For instance, he cites Helmholtz's view, quote, that it is natural for the attention to be distracted from one thing to another. As soon as the interest in one object has been exhausted and there's no longer anything new in it to be perceived, it's transferred to something else, even against our will. When we wish to rivet it on an object, we must constantly seek to find something novel about it, And this is especially true when other powerful impressions of the senses are tugging at it and trying to distract it. But at the same time, whereas Crary seems unwilling to countenance the possibility of any encounter with the genuinely new, in contrast to the products of capitalism, Bergson seems to place a greater faith in the powers of an educated attention to ensure that our perception of change is not merely the return of the same. Repetition is merely in the eye of the beholder, as it were. Our ability to see the difference within the product of capitalism even rests on our ability to attend to things as processes, insofar as time for Bergson is always a real invention, never simply a rearrangement of the pre-existing. In this sense, Bergson seems to reject any notion of perception as hardwired, either by historical or biological conditions. Rather, he suggests that we can orchestrate physical encounters, and I'll suggest as art, as performance, that have the capacity to reconstruct the brain, to create perception anew. An extension of the faculties of perceiving is possible, Bergson insists. And in the past, he notes, artists have been the ones to see and to make us see what we do not naturally perceive. For my own part, I'm particularly interested in the extent to which performance might invite us to participate in what we could call counter forms of attention. So modes of attending or attentional experiences that resist the dominant ways in which attention is structured and organized, and more specifically, modes of attention that resonate in some way with Bergson's aim for philosophy, namely to grasp change and duration in their original mobility, in what we could consider to be a kind of performative form of what he calls intuition. In particular, I've looked into the work of Alan Capro and to the scores he produced for his late participatory works, not the happenings, but what he called his activities. Between the late 60s and 2001, Capro scored and enacted more than 100 of these activities, including those that took place in an educational context. Many of these performed around the environment of Cal Arts, where he worked, but also those that were commissioned by galleries and festivals and tended to be performed by volunteers in their homes. In his writing around these works, Capro not only seems to share Bergson's interest in this expansive rather than exclusive notion of attention, but also specifically conceives attention as that which might increase our experience of change, lived change, and decrease our sense of ourselves as somehow detached, discrete subjects. For instance, many of the activities involve participants' attention being drawn to processes of material change, ice melting, temperature rising, skin drying, as well as to our tendency, noted by Bergson, to abstract these indivisible movements into discrete states. And further, like much durational performance, the length of time the activity takes is not determined by a quantity of clock time, but a quality of lived time, where my duration coincides with that of the other participants and materials, such as ice. So, for example, here is a score, and actually this was an unrealized activity by Capro, but it's an action that I've sort of since repeated a number of times with my students and at various festivals. But here's his score. Carrying a cube of ice in the mouth, carrying a cube of ice in the hand, walking on, swallowing the melting ice till it's gone, calling out, now, walking on, waiting for the hand to hold no ice, calling out, now, walking on, waiting for the hand to dry, calling out, now, walking on. In practice, participants report struggling, trying to decide when to call out now, finding themselves questioning whether ice is still ice when it has become water, and shifting from a concentration on the tactile to the close visual attention required to determine when a hand is fully dry. So you see people going from this to this kind of movement. So always the Capro scores are sort of deceptively simple. You think you know what he's asking you to do, and then it turns out there are all these uncertainties that need to go on in the process of performing the action. Already, Capro's former teacher, John Cage, had proposed that we redefine our very notion of art in terms of attention. Music, Cage suggested, is a way of paying attention to sounds, and visual art is paying attention to looking or seeing. Further, both Cage and Capro would go on to emphasize the powers of attention to enable us to see a richness in routine, to find interest in the apparently uninteresting or banal. Attention exposes the artificiality and openness of what appears natural and given, Capro suggests, increasing the perceptibility of those aspects of life that have become, he says, almost too familiar to grasp. For example, Capro discusses brushing his teeth as an act that had, quote, become routinized, non-conscious behavior in comparison to his first efforts to do it as a child. Capro reports, I began to suspect that 99% of my daily life was just as routinized and unnoticed, that my mind was always somewhere else, and that the 1,000 signals my body was sending me each minute were ignored. But ultimately, Capro did not put his faith in attention alone to challenge this habitual distraction or inattention to the ordinary, or at least not inattention understood as an internal attitude that a subject might consciously, voluntarily choose to adopt. Rather, Capro specifically designed his activities to be unrecognizable as either simply art or life in ways that he hoped would increase the likelihood of embodied attention being forced upon us rather than either detached spectatorship or distracted doing. Capro is not simply against observation and pro-participation in terms of art. Indeed, many of the activities involved acts of observation of one participant by another or by participants of themselves. For instance, and this is the image on the left, a 1975 activity called Useful Fictions involves the following instructions. A and B, close behind, walking up long hill or flight of stairs. A, holding large mirror before face, keeping eyes on B's reflection throughout. B, copying A's movements. Again, it's surprisingly difficult to do. It sounds simple. However, Capro is critical of the illusion of transcendence. So he's not critical of observation, but he's critical of the idea that observation is from a position of detachment or withdrawal, seemingly encouraged by the conventional seated audiences of proscenium arch theatre, or as we are here, but more explicitly invoked by the modernist desire for a timeless mode of vision in which disinterested aesthetic contemplation is seen as in need of emancipation from the distractions of the body. Watching and listening in the midst of doing, he suggests, is very distinct from the specialized observations of a physically passive audience. Only the mind is awake for a traditional audience at best, he says, and it has no responsibility for the actual work. It can only judge. So whereas in Bergson there was a concern for the limitations imposed upon perception on account of its attachment to action, so this tendency to see things in terms of what use they have for us, Capro approaches the problem differently, by inviting participants to engage in attending to actions that are deliberately self-defeating, inefficient, or without an obvious goal, in ways that might render them economically unjustifiable, a waste of time that fails to repay the investment of attention according to a capitalist logic. Here is the score for an activity called Charity from 1969. Buying piles of old clothes, washing them in an all-night laundromat, giving them back to used clothing stores. And another from an activity called Calendar from 1971. Planting a square of turf amid grass like it. Planting another amid grass a little less green. Planting 4 more squares in places progressively drier. Planting a square of dry turf amid grass like it. Planting another amid grass a little less dry. Planting 4 more squares in places progressively greener. In this way, the activities perhaps raise some interesting questions regarding the extent to which the mode of attention I've extrapolated from Bergson might be triggered by an external event or internal attitude. To what extent is it the nature of what we are doing, and to what extent how it is done that matters here? So to conclude, and looking at my timer, I've gone rather faster than I expected, but I hope that's okay. In The Shallows, Nicholas Carr argues that it's our desire for an attraction to the new that has us compulsively checking our phones, compulsively checking the internet, inviting our attention to be distracted, he says. We want to be interrupted, because each interruption, email, tweet, instant message, RSS headline, brings us a valuable piece of information. To turn off these alerts is to risk feeling out of touch or even socially isolated. The stream of new information also plays to our natural tendency to overemphasize the immediate. We crave the new even when we know it's trivial. But for Bergson and for Capro, the new as ceaseless change is already in the ordinary and the routine, if only we attended to it. This production of novelty does not distract us, but is precisely the process with which attention might seek to coincide. The creative nature of life, the changing nature of all things, means that we can never exhaust the novelty of experience, contra Helmholtz's view that I quoted before. We only draw our thinking to a halt when we think we know what we are attending to. In this talk, then, I've tried to look at two basic paradigms of attention. One in which attention constitutes a focusing or a narrowing of perception, which reveals the nature of objects in greater profundity by shining a light upon them. The crisis of attention in this paradigm is the distraction of that gaze when it hops from one discrete thing to another, or the diffusion of that spotlight over too many different things at once, what the informational paradigm might call skimming and multitasking, respectively. Both the informational and culturalist paradigms I've addressed arguably conceive attention as a transcendent representation of an object, such that to enhance attention, to save it from this crisis, means to shine more light on a thing, to make a conscious decision to think harder about it, to look at it more closely. By contrast, in the Capro-Bergson paradigm, what we might call the immanent paradigm, attention is a thing in itself, rather than a mere effect of the sum of human discourses, but understood as a process rather than a static object. In turn, the solution here to the crisis of attentiveness is not a question of bringing more power of attention or perception, more consciousness, more representation to the thing, but ironically less of those representationalist elements, less selection, and more a kind of immersion in the object understood as a process. Less conscious effort and more an immanent mode of thought forced upon us by the thing itself. Bergson defines the philosophical practice of intuition as a reversal of the direction of thought. Philosophy moving in the opposite direction from its usual trajectory. Concepts don't come from us and project themselves onto the object here, but move in the other direction from the object to us. The attended is attending us. The object as process is thinking us. This is the nature of an expanded perception or an attention without the blinders that restrict it in consciousness. Intention is not about a decision to think harder, look harder, about a recognizable X, whatever that might be. Rather, attention occurs when an unexpected Y forces us to think anew. Recall Capro's encounter with brushing his teeth. This was an occurrence in routine that forced itself upon his attention. I began this talk with Bifo and the notion of attention under siege, an image that seemed to call upon us to batten down the hatches, to protect proper cognitive work from unwanted distractions. But perhaps an immanent art, an immanent performance philosophy begins precisely when we genuinely let the outside in, not by paying more attention to things in our lives, but by sensing when the life of things catches our attention. Of course, this language of letting in or sensing raises other questions about the nature of the will, effort, or even decision possibly at work here, immanently. Is it ours, our will, our volition at all, whoever this we may be? And if so, how would it differ from a decisive, transcendent representation? And in turn, this raises questions about artistic authorship, and I hope those might be things that we could pick up in the discussion afterwards. Thank you.